Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today we're in one of the battleship's 5-inch gun mounts to answer a question that we got that's actually a really good one. Why does the main battery gun in American battleships, and all battleships around the world for that matter, keep going up in size, but the secondary battery guns remain practically consistent throughout the construction of battleships? From the second class of American dreadnoughts all the way on to the last classes being designed like the Montanas, the secondary battery guns of American battleships were 5-inch caliber, even though the main battery guns go from 12-inch to 14 to 16, and there's even studies into 18-inch guns and larger weapons. So why is that the case? Pre-dreadnought type battleships had mixtures of secondary battery guns on board, with ships like the Connecticut class, the final large class of American pre-dreadnoughts, having a 12-inch main battery, but then having 8-inch and 7-inch and 6-inch and 5-inch and 3-inch and a couple of other smaller calibers all thrown in there. And that's a logistical nightmare with all of these guns lying around. And it's a fire control nightmare because now all these guns need different elevations to engage targets at the same range, and they're making relatively similar shell splashes in the ocean. So it's not doing much good. So at the same time that Great Britain is going to HMS Dreadnought, which is removing all of those intermediate calibers and just has 12-inch main battery guns and 3-inch anti-torpedo boat guns, the United States does the exact same thing with the South Carolina class dreadnoughts, 12-inch and 3-inch. These 3-inch projectiles end up being too light. As destroyers, the main targets that your secondary battery is there to defend you against, these smaller, faster moving vessels that your main battery guns might not be able to track, that are still armed with weapon systems that couldn't damage your dreadnought, namely their torpedoes, you need a battery of guns that can deal with them. And the 3-inch gun just didn't have the stopping power to deal with the torpedo boats and torpedo boat destroyers, which eventually become destroyers of the early 1900s, 1910s. So the very next classes of dreadnoughts that come out start to use 5-inch guns. By the time the navies of the world start to go to super dreadnoughts, you start to see the main battery guns increase to 13.5 or 14 inches, or finally catching up with 12 inches in the German case. You also start to see an increase in the secondary battery gun, that anti-torpedo boat battery, to a, sometimes they're 5.5 inches. HMS Hood has guns like that. Sometimes they're 6 inches. The Iron Duke class have that. Sometimes they're 5.9 inches, so practically 6 inches, like some of the German ships end up getting. Even American designs, like the original South Dakota class battleships and Lexington class battle cruisers, finally start to jump from a 5-inch torpedo boat battery to a 6-inch torpedo boat battery. But then those ships aren't built, and when we start building battleships again, it's back to the 5-inch gun. So what is it that makes this size, give or take? There are some battleships that use 4.5 or 5.25 or but somewhere around this 5-inch, 127 millimeter battery. What makes this ideal for a battleship secondary? And the simple answer to this is the weight of the projectile. The projectile is essentially the heaviest it can be while still being manually served. By the time New Jersey is coming into service, there are beginning to be attempts at autoloading guns. The US Navy is developing a 6-inch autoloader and an 8-inch autoloader, and those weapon systems will eventually be capable. They aren't quite there yet. So the US Navy needs a gun that's going to be fast firing, and the fastest way to get a gun to fire is to just throw a bunch of guys at the problem and have them play aggressive hot potato with the heaviest possible thing. This 5-inch projectile right here for the American 5-inch 38 weighs 55 pounds. And even going back to ancient times, this is right around what humans are expected to carry. So if you go on an expedition, an archaeological expedition to the Middle East or the cradle of civilization, and you dig up some iron ingots that are being traded between the various city-states there to create bronze, those ingots all come in around 60 pounds. So somewhere in the high 50s to the low 60s in weight, because that is what is man-portable. They're specifically referred to as oxhide ingots because they're sort of cut out in the same sort of shape as when you skin an ox, with like protrusions at the ends that act as handles, so these guys can move them around to load them into ships or whatever else the case may be. Now, it's telling that 4 or 5 millennium later, humans have gotten a little bit taller, but we're still moving around things at roughly that same size. If you start to get larger than this 55-pound projectile, you have to start to introduce mechanical loading features, hoists that are going to be doing more of the work moving these shells around, and other mechanical features like that, which, quite frankly, slow the system down until you get a true auto-loading system in the 1950s, about a decade after the United States stops building battleships. So that weight ends up being ideal. With a 4-inch projectile, the weight just isn't heavy enough. It's not a heavy enough shell to carry a large enough bursting charge to do enough damage to these torpedo boat destroyers or aircraft. This weapon system also evolves to be the primary anti-aircraft weapon on American battleships, going from a purely torpedo boat system in the 19-teens and 20s and then becoming developed through the use of different calibers of gun, i.e. length of the barrel, to be dual purpose or purely anti-aircraft depending on the caliber. But they're all firing roughly the same sort of shell. And likewise, you start to get up to 5.5 inches, 5.9 inches, 6 inches. This projectile gets a little bit heavier than is man-portable. So for example, 6-inch 47 caliber shells, the really fantastic shell that American light cruisers are armed with during World War II, such as the Brooklyn and Cleveland class. They come with a couple different flavors, roughly 100 pounds each. So those stop being man-portable. And while those guns can get a rate of fire of up to 10 rounds per minute, whereas a weapon system like this is somewhere around 12 rounds per minute, and that's a shell that's almost twice as big, so it's going to have a bigger bursting charge, much better weapon. It just cannot be sustained. You can't have a guy sitting there and moving those 100-pound shells all day during repeated anti-aircraft attacks the way you can with a 55-pound 5-inch shell. Just like our ancient ancestors in the Near East were moving ingots like this around all day, the gun crew in one of these guns can start slinging these shells out at a high rate of fire and sustain that. It is worth pointing out that while the 5-inch gun has now become the main battery artillery system on American warships and primarily around the world, those projectiles have gotten larger. Things like the 5-inch 54 caliber gun that supplant the 5-inch 38 eventually have a longer projectile that is then heavier in the 70-pound range, and interestingly, that gun ceases to be manually operated. It becomes a full auto-load system. And so the 5-inch guns on modern warships are also auto-loaders, but they do fire a slightly heavier projectile than these. So, what do you think? Does it make sense for the navies of the world to maintain weapon systems of this caliber throughout basically the entire dreadnought era? Or do you think they should have increased or decreased? Let us know in the comments section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below for ways you can donate to support the museum. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about the museum and our channel. Thanks for watching.